Good evening all, and welcome to another video in the middle of the woods. Tonight's installment will be all about hiking, so I hope your boots are prepared and your headlamp adequately adjusted on your head, because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek through woodland and rural villages, following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together. I was out of shape at the time, and so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight like what I would have done during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through woods in a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey we were on a dirt trail heading uphill, with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, when all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit, with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He appeared to be in his late 70s to early 80s, very pale with liver spots dotting his face and a grey-white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that and goes into the woods? The instant thought, seeing a guy his age out there in those clothes in this weather, was that he had lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us as we were for seeing him. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking him if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After perhaps a minute, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him, so continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope that was presumably at a 40-degree angle, spanned for perhaps 50 feet or more, and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given that there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross that so cleanly and quickly. I mean, all that distance is hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear he still did not appear to be wet or muddy in the slightest. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting weirded out, as was I. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and was going to try and make my way down this, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath he said to me, Something's wrong here. We took a few steps back from the edge at this point, and the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that we would head back to our car and call the emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon, and that they would have all the tools they needed. The old man suddenly got furious. He began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now or there would be hell to pay. His voice has drastically changed. He was practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry schoolboy throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a fully grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets, his skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter of a mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police, so that we could show them where we had encountered him. An hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and packs of supplies like first aid, emergency blankets, and the like. We led them to the exact spot, and then pointed to the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes. The search lasted all weekend, but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date. I live in rural Australia. One early summer afternoon, I was bushwalking down a big-ass hill, which has a river down at the bottom. From the peak of the hill to the base is about 500 meters. However, the track sort of snakes in back and forth like an S shape, as it's too steep of a hill to just go straight down. About a third of the way down, I spotted a pair of feet from about the ankles down sticking out between some bushes, with the feet running perpendicular to the track. As I got closer, I could see that a man was lying down there, and based on his body position assumed he was resting, and likely homeless and or disoriented, seeking shade from the summer sun, further adding to my theory that he was homeless. He had long hair, a long head, and was wearing track pants, and it was 35 degrees Celsius at least. I got about 100 meters from where I saw the man, and was now on a section of the track, running parallel and below to where he was, now walking in the opposite direction. I had followed a curve on the track S. I saw that this man was suddenly running down. Seeing this unnerved me, as based on his outfit, he did not appear to be a local jogger. As fight or flight began to kick in, I pulled out my inhaler, took a puff, and pretended that I was about to start jogging. I wanted to commit to my act, in case I had judged him wrongly, and he was really a local jogger, albeit a poorly dressed one. He continued to run after me along the track, and I was about 2/3 of the way down when I noticed he was running too hard to merely be a jogger. He was running closer to a sprinting pace than a jog, which, as most people know, is a terrible idea when running downhill, let alone in 35+ degree heat, in track pants, and with no visible water bottle. As he gained ground on me, I decided to sit on my arse and slide down the hill, between sections of the track that ran parallel to one another. Once I finally made it to the bottom and across to the other side of the river, I turned and saw he had stopped running. I continued to walk along the river, when after about 5 steps I heard him yell out something obscene. I continued to run on and off until I made my way back to the nearest road, and am yet to return to that track. Earlier this summer, I was hiking in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. A couple of days into my trip, I got really sick. Sore throat, headache, fatigue, loss of appetite, about the worst cocktail of symptoms for hiking any long distance. I had found a tick on me and was terrified I might have Lyme disease. I decided to get off trail and see a doctor, which is easier said than done in the most remote, inaccessible sections of the whole Appalachian Trail. Thankfully, there are old logging roads which crisscross the wilderness, so I decided to turn off onto a road which, I was told, led to a campground. There I hoped to find some day hikers and get a ride into town. As soon as I turned off the Appalachian Trail, it started pouring with rain, which only increased my misery. A few minutes later, I noticed a dog in the woods. Strange, I thought. Then I saw another dog, and another, and another, and about a dozen big hunting hounds fenced off randomly in the middle of nowhere, Maine. They barked at me, slavering, and pawed at the chicken wire fence, which did not seem strong enough to hold them. This was slightly disconcerting, but the brown trouser moment came when I spotted a lone figure in the woods, what seemed to be a tall man in a hooded blue rain jacket and pants. I couldn't see his face, and he just stood there, still as a statue, severely spooked. I hiked out of there on the double. In the backcountry, it's generally good manners to say hello and exchange pleasantries, but this guy didn't say a word. Maybe it was because of the rain. Maybe he was feeding bodies to his hounds out there. I'll never know. But he definitely saw me, and I could tell that he was watching me go past. I was walking a trail alone one evening, around a huge bluff that sticks up maybe 40 feet tall. The hike is a 1.5-mile hike. As I was on it, I got a call from my girlfriend at the time, so I answered and began to talk to her. It started to get dark, and I was dragging my feet along as we got chatting. All of a sudden, I started hearing rustling all around me. Growing up in a rural area of Illinois, I had a good sense of what was a pack of coyotes. I told my girl I was being followed and needed to have my wits about me. She was a little freaked but understood. I hung up and grabbed my pocket knife and found a stick I could whittle into a point as quickly as I could. As I'm walking down the trail, I could hear the rustling getting closer and closer, turning from stereo sound to 7.1 Dolby, to put it plainly. At this point I knew I was surrounded by them, but couldn't see them. I was on the cusp of a hill, and I wanted to get a good vantage point to defend myself if it were to come to that. As I get to the top of the hill, I notice a doe just over the ridge, maybe 20 yards past it. The rustling had stopped. Everything was quiet. I realized that the coyotes weren't after me, but clearly hunting this deer, which was odd to begin with. I finally yelled, and the deer looked back, saw me, and took off like a bat out of hell. The second the deer moved, 4 coyotes came from behind me and ran full sprint past me, practically scraping my jeans as they passed, and I came careening down the side of the bluff. I stood there for a few minutes trying to figure out what the hell just happened. I haven't taken that trail since. It was pretty damn scary. I grew up in the woods, never had an encounter like that, and hope to never have one like that again. I like to explore and fish a lot. They coincide a lot so it's a pretty big passion of mine. I was hiking along a creek in a rural county near my home, in some dense game lands about 8 or so miles from any house, probably at least double that from a major road or settlement. I had hiked for a while and was hardly seeing any sign of human presence. Nearly every place I go in my state, I can find garbage, hunting trash, or any other sign that people have been there. If I see nothing, it is sort of a good sign that the area is undisturbed. As I was hiking, I heard gunshots far away. Not uncommon either, but the forest was oddly quiet, and yes, cliché incoming. I felt super uneasy, as if there was someone else there. Eventually, I found something really strange, and I've looked for the picture forever but can't find it. It was a small metal box, and I was well versed enough to know it was a geocache out in the open at the base of a tree. Let me remind you, this is several miles through thick woods and no sign of human habitation or influence. The box was rusty and looked to have been through a lot. I tried opening it, but a lot of sediment and rust had accumulated, and I got a little give, but nothing significant. There was definitely stuff rattling around, so I tried a ton and nothing would work. I realized it wasn't going to open, so I left it as I found it and put a piece of duct tape on the tree next to it to find it again. I left and went home, downloaded the geocaching app, but the box wasn't registered anywhere, nor were there really any geocaches along that creek at all, none registered for miles, so either it wasn't a geocache or maybe just really old. Anyway, the very next day I went back armed with a crowbar, hammer and pliers. I went back to the exact spot it was in, as I had put the duct tape right around the ground besides the tree, but the box was nowhere to be found. I looked all around and couldn't find it, at which point several miles from civilization and several more from cell service, I booked it out there. I realized that this isn't spooky or supernatural, but it put me on the edge more than anything else I've ever been through. When I was around 10 years old and feeling adventurous, I would go riding my bike down my parents' road, which was dead-ended 2 miles down at the only neighbor's house, or exploring around in the endless acres of pasture surrounding our house. We were way out in the boonies. The back of one pasture sloped down to a slough/creek, which fed into a small pond in our neighbor's pasture. The area had some woods around it, and I decided it was a good place to return to play. The neighbors were an older couple who had lived in the area for years and never really went anywhere, and I didn't think they would mind if I played there. One day I was playing around the pond and found a lot of mussels, like oysters, buried in the mud. I dug a couple and took them home. A few days later in the same spot, it looked like a lot more had been dug up, and they had been opened and eaten, which would be okay for a raccoon or something, but there were some big boot prints that couldn't possibly have been mine. I should have had a lot more sense, but I kept going back after finding things. Once there was a plastic bag full of trash, some ripped up clothes and a tarp. They were still down there next time I came back, and I heard a car coming down the road. I laid my bike down and hid in the slough. It was dried up at this point, about 4 feet deep, on the other side of the pond. And a man pulled up coming from the neighbor's end of the road in a black boxy looking car, maybe a Cadillac, and got out wearing a suit. He grabbed the trash bag and clothes and threw the bones in a hole, looked around, got back in the car, and headed out of there quickly. I went back after he left and looked at the bones and took one of them home. I pedaled as fast as my short, stubby legs would go. My dad said it looked like a deer or cow bone and threw it out. It wasn't until I started studying pre-med in college that I realized it was a human radius, likely that of a woman or older child. I was in Big Bend National Park about 20 years ago, prepping for a backpacking series presentation for REI. Big Bend is the western portion of Texas that dips towards along the bend of the Rio Grande that forms the border with Mexico. It's mixed high desert and smaller mountains. Gorgeous place, great history. I was hiking the area near Santa Elena Canyon, probably a couple of hours before sunset, to try and get pics for the presentation. This area of the park opens into a comparatively flat section of the basin, where the river broadens and the wildlife tends to be more diverse and obvious. I was several hundred meters away from my van, which was parked in a designated lot at what passed for a trailhead at the time. As I approached the river basin near the mouth of my canyon, I saw something really unusual. So unusual, in fact, it took a few seconds for my brain to sort the puzzle. Something was moving on the other side of the river, and it was big, man-sized, but low to the ground. The color of a deer, perhaps? And shuffling along. It looked, for first impression, to be a medium-sized white tail, though, lying on its side and moving like a snake. But that's not a thing that happens, so I moved in a bit to improve my line of sight. It was a mountain lion, a big cat, a very big cat. It was creeping along, low slung, hunting something that was probably no more than a stone's toss from where I was standing. I'd never seen one before, and when the visual information finally passed, I think my blood froze. Then it looked at me. I'll probably never forget that bit. You could see that little calorie calculator turn on in its eyes. I've never been so thankful for a river in my life. Granted, at this time, and maybe still, the river was very low due to the drought and unauthorized and unlawful irrigation practices upstream, and you could likely cross at several points at this location with minimal risk, but it was still quite broad and definitely looked like part of a potent water barrier. Death Kitty does a series of double takes, head shifting from me to whatever the prey location was back and forth rapidly. Said calorie calculator and risk calculator trying to get a fix on this evening's menu. I die a little inside, maintain my facing, and begin slowly and quietly moving away. Not sure if I was worth it, if the river was too much of an X factor, or if the biggin just really wasn't that into me. But no chase was given, and after breaking line of sight, I was able to get back into the van just fine with no signs of pursuit and some mild trachycardia. That was the longest short walk I've ever taken. Later that night I was parked off the main park road in an area where big cats commonly hunted. I'll always remember being parked there in the middle of nowhere, munching on slightly stale Oreos and a bottle of water, listening to the occasional growl or scream of a big cat peel out of the darkness, and being thankful for my relatively fortunate position on the food chain. Also, one night while I was on NyQuil, I hallucinated after getting a respiratory illness and woke up screaming. At a mountain, at 3 a.m, at the public campsite, but that's someone else's scary story. I distance hike when I can. Sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes walking in the pitch dark with a low light headlamp gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under our canopy of stars more nights than I can count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trail, riverbanks, lake shores, ridges, bottoms, bogs and creeks. I've hunted the game, And I'm establishing this because it's important you understand I've heard, seen and smelt about all this region has to offer in way of wilderness. My scariest experience though happened at about 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another 30 to 45 minutes. Another hour passed, that until sunrise. I was on mile 5. I'm in a low bottom that's wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I'm on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in thick underbrush, young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, zoned out. And that's when I heard a loud crack and froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. 4:30 in springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze. When fight or flight kicks in, you have these immediate instincts though. The thought that something flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself into silence was, if I hear it again, I'm turning around and going back the way I came in a hurry. Why? Because that sound was not just a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I had just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, well, that meant I had to get the hell out of there. To describe it as best I can, it sounded like a decently sized wooden stick be violently shaken and whacked against a smallish tree. More a fungo bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head being that this sound was a crack and not a thud or thump, and I have described it as explosive in the past as it was so sudden and terribly loud. I had the sense that it was about 50 yards directly in front of me, and it was loud and clear. Now as I stood there completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worse part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards. I was going to come to an 180-degree turn and start up the ridge, going away from the creek. This meant, as soon as I got the courage to move towards the noise, I was going to have to turn back to it and get up that ridge, and this made me very nervous. My head somewhere between meth fiend murderer and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes pass. I just breathe my foggy breath into my glasses and listen. Nothing. Dead quiet. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes until first light. I crank up the headlamp and start to slowly creep to the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts big black moving shadows on the trail, and that didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point, trying to be quiet, taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while going up the trail. And then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined wet, rotten death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired, in a past life as a firefighter. This was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast, and by the time I made the top of that ridge, I was huffing, and first light was showing. I didn't stop moving until full light was out, and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods, I've smelt it all, and I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall and especially leafed out branches make a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times, but I just don't know what the hell that was. Me and my younger sister had this huge open field behind our house. The space was seemingly endless, and we would often spend our summers and vacations exploring all the backfields. These fields went on for a while, and I'd say after about 3 miles, led to some decently sized hills. We often would enjoy hiking, just because there was nothing better to do where we lived. When this story occurred, I was only 14 and my sister 11. It was your average Saturday, and we had packed up our picnic, as making it was half the fun, and were going to find a decent spot to eat it at while making our way through the fields. Both my parents had extremely demanding jobs. My mother worked on Saturdays all day pretty much, and my dad had more work to catch up on. So he'd be home plowing away on his laptop while we would go out. There's no cell phone service a little further past our house, so our phones were pretty much useless. But we took them just in case, through some sort of miracle, that we got signal, and in case of an emergency. It was your average day. We'd walked past the fields and gotten to the hills. That's when we went a different route. My sister said that she saw something on the floor, something shiny. We made our way and found a little less traveled path. We'd never come this way. I don't know why, we just never decided to explore this part. She tells me that she wants to go this way, as the shiny thing had brought her luck, and this way was the right way to go. When she showed me what she'd found, it appeared to be a chip, the likes of which you might see inside a phone or a computer. So someone had obviously broken something and scattered whatever electronic device this was all around the woods, which is weird enough. We carried on with our hike, my sister leading, and the path became even more ruggedy as the hills got steeper, going up and down. Part of the fun for me was going to places I didn't know, but something about this hike made me feel uneasy. I wasn't entirely sure what, but my sister seemed happy, so I followed her without complaint. We'd been gone for at least 4 hours now, and as anyone who's hiked knows, 4 hours of walking and hiking will certainly make your stomach grumble. I tell my sister that I'm hungry and to eat the sandwiches and snacks that we had packed. We look around for a decent place to eat, perhaps a log or a rock, but right now there didn't seem to be anything as comfortable. We carried on for approximately 5 minutes before we found a decently sized fallen log that we could comfortably sit on. My sister pulled out the sandwiches and snacks from my backpack, got the drinks, and we started chatting, eating, and generally having a good time. This spot where we had stopped wasn't anything special, but as we spoke, I heard something strange. I asked her to stop munching for a moment, and I heard a sound like the snapping of a twig. I looked frantically in all directions, but was met with nothing. There was a slight echo to the sound too, a reverberance that made me shudder. I looked around again. The sound seemed to be coming from a bit further down, directly below us. We were almost at the crest of a hill, and we couldn't see far down, especially not to where this was. But as we looked down, we could see that it was easy enough to go down and investigate the source of this sound. I was curious, but my sister didn't want to come. She said it sounded scary, like something was biting bones. I laughed at her, told her she was being ridiculous, but had no intention of going off in a hurry as my sandwich was still half eaten, and I had a cereal bar and more snacks to devour before I even thought about moving from my spot. About 20 minutes had passed, and the sound by this point had stopped. I was still curious and begged my sister to come with me. She refused, and so I started making my way round, and when she realized how far I was, did she scream that she was coming too and chase after me. We make our way down, and this is when we see the opening of a small cave, almost like a crack in the stone of this hillside. We look at each other. I pull out my phone and illuminate with a flashlight the crevice-like space. We inch closer, being very careful to walk quietly as to not spook whatever was making that sound. By this point, I just thought it was an animal, and where we live, we don't have anything dangerous, so I wasn't worried. I was just interested to see what there was. I poke my phone in further, peering, trying as hard as I can to focus in the dark. And as we get closer, I notice that the cave is actually larger than I'd expected. My sister holds my hand in fright as we make our way into the darkness. I flash around, but my phone light isn't very strong and only illuminates a little bit ahead of us. I listen, and there's a rustling in the back. My sister squeaks, the sound frightening her, and tugs on my arm that she wants to leave, but I pull back, and with a look, tell her that I want to keep going. The ground was ordinary, and after a few steps, do we crunch with our feet and look down. There was a small animal bone on the ground. My sister goes, "Ew!" and pulls me again, insisting that we leave. I shine my phone around one more time. This cave is big, and it's not worth upsetting my sister to explore it. Maybe I'll come another day alone, I think to myself. I let her pull me away, and that's when she stops. I heard it too. Something made a sound in the cave. I turn my flashlight in that direction when I see a man stand. He is completely naked, although I couldn't make everything out in high detail, as, like I said, the illumination from my phone isn't the best. We stand there frozen for a second before my sister jolts me and we run. The man just stands there. When we reach the mouth of the cave, which is only wide enough for one person to go through at a time, my heart is thumping out my chest. I push my sister through, and in the moment I have to spare as her butt is going up, I turn around and look at him. He's still standing there from his perch, looking at us. I just about crap myself, scream, and we run for about 20 minutes straight, before my sister breaks down crying and scolds me, telling me that we should have never have gone in there. When we get home, fatigued and annoyed at each other, we both rush to tell my dad what happened. I tell him what we saw, and as does my sister, she also saying how important it was to know that it was my idea to go in there in the first place. My dad didn't believe us. He said there's no reason for a man to be hiding in a cave and kind of dismissed us and shooed us away. And that was that. We went to bed that night, sulky that our dad didn't believe us. But the next day in the morning, as we're having breakfast, a police car shows up. The police officer sits us down and asks us a few questions pertaining to what we saw. We give him a vague idea of where this cave was and tell him about the man that was naked and the fact that we'd stepped on bones. He gives me a worried look, says thank you for my help, and is off. It turns out my dad called the police as he was worried and just didn't want to frighten us by believing our story, and admitted to this later that day. A few weeks later, we see on the news that a man has been caught. I didn't know if it was him or not, but they mentioned that he'd been living out in the woods and avoiding police capture for about 3 months. He was wanted for the murder of his mother. I'm so glad that we ran when we did, and I will always regret putting my sister and myself in that danger. Were we close to death? I suppose I'll never know, but I am very glad indeed that we didn't have the opportunity to find out. I went on a midnight walk with my girlfriend. The park by her house has a dirt trail that led up a small mountain. It was about a 30-minute walk to the top, but the view overlooking the city was gorgeous. At the top, the dirt path became paved concrete with a small sitting area. We stayed at the top for about 30 minutes. Upon leaving is where things got creepy. As we started to head back down, at the point where the concrete met dirt path, there was a large pile of trash bags in a crescent shape in the corner of the path's intersection. It was not there when we first arrived. The pile was much too large and in the way for someone who likes to cut corners of paths to notice. My girlfriend remarked at how the shape resembled a dead body and asked me if I had noticed it on the way up. I was very sure that it was not there 30 minutes prior when we arrived. I was extremely sure. Nonetheless, there was no reason to freak my anxiety-prone girlfriend out, so I laughed and said, "Yeah, must have been there, and it was probably trash." Visibility was extremely low, probably about 5 yards, and I didn't want to freak her out, but I was pretty tilted, and I got heckled for being drunk and not listening to her. But in actuality, I was looking and listening for any signs of people around us. In my own head, I was telling myself that I'm just being paranoid, and that it was probably there and I didn't notice it to begin with. But at the same time, I was also sure that it wasn't. I'm sorry I didn't have time to listen to your story about Jesse from work. I'm worried about our safety at the moment. We made it back to our car without running into anyone, but I kind of laughed at myself for being worried about nothing, and also felt the relaxation of my butt muscles that had been clenched for the last half hour. A few days later, the local news covered a dead body found near a park in Anthem at the top of the mountains. Guys, it was actually a dead body. Literally getting chills just saying that. It was actually someone dead. Thank God that my girlfriend didn't watch the news, or she'd have probably shat herself. When my sister and I were younger, we used to go to Faxon Park in Quincy and spend hours exploring the woods. Not a lot of woods in a suburban city, so we took advantage of what we had. One day we were pretty deep in there and came upon a clearing. There were a couple of fire rings and 3 trees had been cut down, stripped and propped together to make a tripod. There was a length of frayed rope hanging from the middle. There were some empty booze bottles and trash strewn about, and a few logs arranged like benches. The whole arrangement reminded us of a courtroom. There was nothing overly creepy about this scene at the moment, but we felt a little uneasy knowing that something had gone to the trouble to set all of this up in the middle of the woods. Cut to a week later, I'm reading the local paper, and the front page has a story about a homeless man that was murdered in Faxon Park. Turns out another homeless dude got into an argument with him. A group of them had been drinking in the woods and strung him up by his feet in a makeshift tripod and held their own trial before beating him to death. We had unknowingly stumbled upon the crime scene. To this day, I'm ever so thankful that we didn't find the body. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so very much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. As always, a huge thank you to my incredible and supportive patrons for your help. Your donations really help run the channel and keep everything ticking over here at Mortis Media. For as little as $1 a month, you can have your name up on the screen at the end of every episode, which is pretty cool, along with a handful of other perks. I mean, that's just for $1. There are even cooler things for a little bit more, if you're interested, of course. No obligation, no worries. But yes, if you liked today's video, don't forget to do the usual, the liking, the subscribing, all the buttons, and all the comments. That would be pretty amazing. If you've stayed this late into the video, well, congrats. You actually listened to all the stories. That's pretty awesome. I've been thinking about doing poop stories. I haven't done them in a while, not because they're scary, well, I suppose in a way they are, but more because they are absolutely hilarious. Little accidents people have. There's one story that has been my favorite for a while. It's of the girl who needs to take a dump at her new boyfriend's house. It doesn't flush, so she picks it up with toilet paper and flings it out the window. And then it scrapes down onto their, what's it called? Like the conservatory of their home. And she comes down all confident and proud, and when she looks at the family all eating under the conservatory table, does she notice they're all staring in horror at the ceiling because her turd is slowly making its way down the window. I mean, that is just comedy gold. The imagery is hilarious. I'm sure some of you will disagree, but I disagree with you. I think it's so funny. Just the tragedy of that story. Hopefully there'll be more of that. Of course, you will need to vote for poop stories in order to make it happen, but rest assured if poop doesn't win anytime soon, I'll just throw it in the mix. Just as a great, funny video. But yeah, enough rambling now. For now, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome. Don't do what the girl did and fling your poop out of a window. And I'll see you in the next one.